Chapter 1. The Blood of Edwin. Gwynedd, 1125, 48 years later. Scene 1. The road east. Morning mist still clung to the lower valleys, as two riders followed the winding track east towards Tejingle. The mountains of Gwynedd rose behind them, their dark slopes catching the first rays of the sun, while ahead the land softened into broad wooded hills and fertile river valleys. The countryside around them was awake. Smoke curled gently from scattered farmsteads where families were already beginning their day's work. Small stone churches stood upon low hills, their weathered crosses rising above churchyards that had watched over generations of Welshmen. Sheep grazed upon the hillsides while cattle wandered the rich pasture below. Somewhere beyond the trees came the rhythmic sound of an axe striking timber, followed by the distant barking of dogs. The younger of the two riders, Prince Owen ap Gruffydd, had the easy confidence of a man entirely at home upon the roads of his kingdom. At 32 years of age, he had grown into a broad-shouldered man, his dark chestnut hair falling to his shoulders beneath a simple woolen cloak. A neatly kept beard framed a thoughtful face, while calm gray eyes missed little of the life unfolding around him. Owen drew his horse to a slower pace and looked across the landscape. This was Gwynedd, not merely a kingdom marked upon a map, but a living land. Beside him rode his elder brother, Prince Cadwallon. 4 years older, he possessed the heavier build of a seasoned warrior. His dark beard was trimmed shorter than Owen's, and years spent in the saddle had hardened both body and face. His broad shoulders seemed almost too large for his horse, while keen brown eyes rarely wandered from the road ahead, forever judging distance, ground, and danger. As the brothers passed a cluster of cottages, an old woman paused from drawing water at a well. Seeing the riders, she bowed her head respectfully. "God keep you, princes." "And you," Owen replied with a warm smile. Children abandoned their games to watch the two horsemen ride past. One little boy waved enthusiastically before his father gently lowered the child's arm and bowed instead. Further along the road, a priest emerged from a small church carrying a basket of herbs. He raised his hand in blessing. "Bendith do Arnoch." "The blessing of God upon you also, father," Owen answered in Welsh. The priest smiled before continuing towards the village. Cadwallon scarcely acknowledged any of them. His eyes remained fixed upon the road ahead. The silence between the brothers lasted for several miles. Only the steady rhythm of hooves and the songs of birds disturbed the morning air. After a while they crossed a narrow stone bridge spanning a fast-flowing river. Owen rested one hand upon the saddle horn and watched the water rush beneath them. "Our father would have enjoyed this ride." Cadwallon gave a short nod. He spent half his life in exile dreaming of seeing these valleys again. Owen looked towards the mountains behind them, and the other half making certain they remained ours. For a time neither brother spoke. Gruffydd ap Cynan had inherited a kingdom broken by war, divided by Norman invasion and weakened by years of exile. Through patience, alliances, and determination, he had rebuilt the house of Aberffraw until peace once again stretched across most of Gwynedd. Every church bell they heard, every prosperous farm they passed, every traveler walking the roads without fear, all of it had been bought by the struggles of the previous generation. Owen looked across the valleys. "Father has reclaimed much." Cadwallon nodded. "Rose, Rufoniog, Marianid. Much but not all. The Normans still watch us from the eastern marches." Owen smiled faintly. "I remember Rose. They thought we'd come to plunder. Instead they found themselves subjects of Gwynedd. Had we delayed, Powys would have taken the lands." Cadwallon shrugged. "Or Chester." They rode on for a time before Owen spoke again. "Marianid proved harder. The mountains always do." Yet now a man can ride from Anglesey almost to the Dyfy without leaving father's kingdom. Cadwallon looked east. Not almost. Soon. Owen silently thanked God that he had lived to see such a kingdom. The road climbed steadily through the wooded hills until the trees thinned, revealing the broad lands of Tejingle stretching towards the distant Dee estuary. Cadwallon reined in his horse upon the crest of the ridge. There, he said. Owen followed his gaze. Beyond the scattered farms and church towers lay a prosperous countryside. Rich fields spread across the gentle slopes, enclosed by low stone walls and ancient hedgerows. Well-kept halls overlooked the valleys below, while orchards and watermills spoke of generations of peace and prosperity. To the east, the silver waters of the Dee broadened towards the sea, carrying merchants and travelers between Wales and England. For a long moment, neither brother spoke. Then Cadwallon broke the silence. The lands of Edwin. Scene 2, the lands of Edwin. The road descended from the ridge into Tejingle. Before long, the country began to feel familiar. A stream crossed beneath the track ahead. Beyond it stood an old mill, its wheel turning steadily beside the water, while orchards climbed the gentle slope behind it. Owen smiled. Gwenllian fell in there. Cadwallon followed his gaze. Then he laughed. She tried to jump it. She was 8. She said the horse could manage it. The horse did. Gwenllian didn't. Cadwallon laughed again. For the first time that morning, the severity disappeared from his face. They had spent summers here as children. Not every year and never for long, but often enough that these roads belonged amongst their earliest memories. Gwenllian stealing honey cakes from the kitchens. Cadwallader disappearing after the hunting dogs. Owen and Cadwallon climbing the old oak behind the hall, while their mother shouted warnings from below. Back then, Tejingle had meant none of the things it meant now. It had meant family. Owen looked across the fields. Mother always changed when we came here. Cadwallon glanced towards him. How? She seemed younger. Cadwallon smiled faintly. She wasn't Lady Angharad here. No, she was just Angharad. Their mother had never called Tejingle by its name when speaking of these visits. She called it home. And the men awaiting them were not merely lords of Tejingle. They had been Goronwy, Reared and Mailer. Their mother's brothers. Their uncles. The thought drained the last of Owen's smile. We could still turn back. Cadwallon looked at him. And tell father what? That we found no reason to do this. We weren't sent to find one. No. That was what troubled Owen. Their father had sent them east merely to settle the position of the house of Edwin in Tejingle. Gruffydd was growing old. Chester remained a threat beyond the eastern frontier, and the descendants of Edwin, who had once ruled much of this country, still possessed land, wealth, and followers close to the border. Cadwallon had been given authority to settle the matter. Owen had ridden with him. But there was a considerable distance between breaking a family's power and what Cadwallon intended to do. Father said their position had to be settled. Yes. He didn't order their deaths. No. Yet that is what you're going to do. Cadwallon looked ahead. Yes. No hesitation. Owen had spent much of the journey trying to find one. Goronwy has served father for years. So did Edwin. There it was. Edwin. Their mother's grandfather. Yet Edwin's story had not begun with betrayal. When Gruffydd first crossed from Ireland to reclaim Gwynedd, Edwin had supported him. His men had joined Gruffydd's, and at Bron or Urwa they had fought together against Trahean. And they had won. For one glorious moment, Gruffydd must have believed his struggle was over. Father trusted him, Cadwallon said. He had reason to. And Edwin gave him reason to regret it. Cadwallon looked towards him. Does the reason matter to the man who loses his kingdom? Of course it matters. Father trusted Edwin. Edwin helped him win Gwynedd, then turned against him when alliances shifted. Half of Wales changed allegiance in those years. Exactly, and Father spent years paying for it. Owain knew where the story went next. Edwin died, but the power of his family did not. Among his sons was Owain. Owain Fradwr, the traitor, their maternal grandfather. Years later, when the Norman earls of Chester and Shrewsbury descended upon Gwynedd, Owain Fradwr chose them. He knew the country. His family possessed influence along its eastern approaches. And his daughter was Angharad, their mother. He helped Father's enemies, Cadwallon said. The Normans took Anglesey. Father was driven across the sea again. And Father came back. Because Magnus came. He still came back. Cadwallon shook his head. You always do that. Do what? Look at how something ended and forgive everything that came before it. And you remember everything that went wrong and assume it must happen again. Perhaps because it does. Owain fell silent. Father trusted Edwin, Cadwallon continued. Edwin turned against him. Years later, when Gwynedd weakened, Owain Fradwr chose the Normans. And after that, Cadwallon knew what he meant. Owain looked across the country, where their mother had been born. Father could have destroyed their family. He should have. He didn't. No. He married into it. That silenced them both. Edwin had helped Gruffydd win Gwynedd, and later opposed him. Edwin's son had helped drive him from it. Yet once Gruffydd had finally secured his kingdom, he had chosen not to pass that feud to another generation. He knew exactly who Mother was, Owain said. I know. He knew what her father had done. Yes. And that's part of why marrying her mattered. Cadwallon frowned. Father had recovered Gwynedd, but Edwin's family hadn't disappeared. They still had land, followers, and influence here. He could keep treating them as enemies and wait for their sons to inherit the quarrel. Owain looked towards him. Or he could bind them to Aberffraw. Through Mother. Yes. Angharad had been Owain Fradwr's daughter, but she had not shared his guilt. By marrying her, Gruffydd had turned a rival house into kin. Her brothers became his brothers by marriage. Their children shared blood with his own. It had not erased the past, but it had given both houses a reason not to repeat it. So it was politics, Cadwallon said. Of course it was politics. They both knew what the marriage meant. Owain paused. But it became more than that. They both knew it had. Whatever had first brought Gruffydd and Angharad together, their sons had grown up watching what followed. A marriage intended to reconcile two houses had become a family. Father could have made Mother's family his enemies forever, Owain said. Instead, he made them ours. And you think that means they cannot betray us? No. Owain met his eyes. I think Father understood that they didn't have to. Cadwallon looked across Tejingle. And after everything Father did, what does the house of Edwin still possess? Owain knew the answer. Power. Yes. At last. Rich fields surrounded them, prosperous farms, roads running east towards the Dee. The house of Edwin still possessed wealth, followers, and influence upon the most dangerous frontier in Gwynedd. And Gruffydd would not live forever. You think our uncles will rebel when Father dies? I think they will have the power to. That isn't the same thing. No, it is the difference between waiting for danger and preventing it. They have done nothing. Yet, Owain felt something tighten inside him. They have answered father's summons. Yes. Paid their dues. Yes. Fought beside us. Yes. And that means nothing. It means they have been loyal while Gruffydd ap Cynan rules Gwynedd. Cadwalladen's gaze moved east. What happens when he doesn't? Their father had survived exile, imprisonment and invasion, but he was 68 now. One day Gwynedd would wake without him. Chester will look west, Cadwallon continued. Powys will look north. Every Lord Father has brought beneath Aberffraw will decide whether his loyalty belonged to Gwynedd or merely to the man who ruled it. And you believe Goronwy and the others will choose Chester. I don't know what they will choose. Then how can you condemn them? Because I don't intend to gamble Gwynedd upon the answer. There was no hatred in Cadwallon's face. That was what disturbed Owain most. This was not revenge. Cadwallon genuinely believed he was protecting Gwynedd. Edwin had a choice, Cadwallon said. Owain said nothing. Owain Fradwer had a choice. Both chose against father when his position weakened. He gestured towards the surrounding country. Now their sons possess the same land, the same wealth, the same influence. And you have decided how they will choose. No. Cadwallon's answer surprised him. I have decided Gwynedd should never have to find out. The road emerged from the trees. The hall appeared ahead. Both brothers recognized it immediately. Owain remembered arriving here as a boy. Their mother waiting beneath the gate. Gwenllian racing ahead. Cadwallader chasing after her. 3 young men coming from the hall to welcome their sister's children. He wondered whether the old oak still stood. Whether the kitchen still made honey cakes. Whether Angharad would ever forgive what her sons were about to do in the place she still called home. Owain pulled his horse to a halt. Cadwallon stopped beside him. Must they all die? If one remains, the house remains. They are mother's brothers. I know. Say their names. Cadwallon's jaw tightened. Goronwy, Rhirid Mailer. Our uncles. Yes. And you can still do this. Cadwallon met his eyes. When Edwin stood beside father at Bron or Urwa, father believed he had found an ally. And father later forgave his house. When Owain Fradwer chose the Normans, father learned what that forgiveness had cost him. And then he forgave them again. Cadwallon said nothing. Owain looked towards the hall. Perhaps father learned something different. What? That someone has to stop remembering old enemies long enough to make new friends. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Cadwallon's face. Only briefly. And someone has to remember what happened the last time. He urged his horse forward. Owain remained where he was for another moment. Then he followed. Scene 3, a warm welcome. The road descended towards the estate. At first only, the barking of dogs announced their arrival. Then a stable boy spotted the dragon embroidered upon Cadwallon's cloak. He froze. A moment later, he ran towards the hall shouting excitedly. The princes! Servants hurried into the yard. A pair of hounds bounded across the packed earth before being called back by an elderly huntsman. Children abandoned a game beside the well and watched with wide-eyed curiosity as the 2 horsemen approached. One little girl hid behind her mother's skirts, peering cautiously around the folds of her dress. The heavy gates stood open. A steward emerged from the hall, smoothing the front of his tunic before bowing deeply. My princes. Owain inclined his head politely. You honor us with your welcome. The hall is yours. Food has already been prepared. The steward smiled, though uncertainty flickered across his face. Royal visits were unusual. Visits by both sons of the king together were rarer still. Something about the silence surrounding the brothers unsettled him. Men appeared from the workshops and fields, wiping sweat from their hands before bowing respectfully. Women paused in their chores. Even the dogs had stopped barking. The whole household watched, waiting, trying to understand why the heirs of Gwynedd had come unannounced to the house of Edwin. Owen looked across the busy courtyard. He saw ordinary people. Farmers, servants, children. None of them carried weapons. None of them expected what this day would become. He turned towards Cadwallon. It does not have to end in blood. Cadwallon dismounted. Without taking his eyes from the hall, he quietly replied, "It ended in blood long before we arrived." Scene 4, the judgment. The great hall was cool after the warmth of the summer sun. Oak beams disappeared into the darkness above, while smoke drifted lazily towards the roof vents. A long table stood ready for the midday meal. Bread, cheese, and ale had already been laid out, as though the visit of the princes were an unexpected honor rather than a cause for concern. The three sons of Owain Fradwar stepped forward together. Goronwy the eldest bowed first. "My princes." His brothers, Rired and Maelor, followed. "It gladdens us to welcome the sons of our sister Lady Angharad." Owain inclined his head. "She still speaks of this hall." "And of you." Goronwy smiled. "She has always been kind." Behind them stood the rest of the household. Among them was Goronwy's eldest daughter, Lady Kristen. 14 years of age, she possessed long dark hair gathered neatly beneath a fine linen veil, while thoughtful gray eyes observed the visitors with quiet intelligence rather than curiosity. Beside her stood her younger brother, Cadwgan. Only 11 years old, he was tall for his age but still carried the slender build of a growing boy. Dark-haired like his sister, he watched the princes in complete silence, his sharp gray eyes missing little despite his youth. Owain returned the boy's respectful bow with a faint smile. Cadwallon scarcely noticed him. For a moment, it almost felt like family. Servants moved quietly between the tables, setting out cups and trenchers. Somewhere outside, children laughed in the yard. Cadwallon stepped forward. "There will be no meal." The room fell silent. Goronwy frowned. "My prince." Cadwallon looked at each brother in turn. "You stand accused of treason against the house of Aberffraw." The words seemed to rob the hall of its warmth. Rired stared in disbelief. "Treason. We have sworn loyalty to King Gruffud." "You swore loyalty." Cadwallon's voice remained calm. "But your house has never surrendered its ambition." Maelor shook his head. "You wrong us. Our father made peace with your father. Our sister is your mother. We are one family." Owain looked towards Cadwallon. "Brother." Cadwallon did not move. "Today, Tejingal answers only to Aberffraw." The word struck Owain harder than any sword. "Cadwallon." Before he could speak again, armed men entered through both doors. Not charging, not shouting, simply surrounding the hall. The brothers understood immediately. Goronwy looked from one prince to the other. Realization slowly replaced confusion. This was never a visit. No, it was judgment. Rired took a single step forward. "If we have offended the crown, let us answer before the king. The king entrusted this matter to me." Maelor looked directly at Owain. "You know this is wrong." For a heartbeat, Owain said nothing. His mouth opened. No words came. Cadwallon raised one hand. "Do it." The soldiers moved at once. There was no battle. No heroic last stand. Only confusion. A servant screamed. One of the brothers tried to reach for the knife at his belt before two spears drove him backwards. Another fell to his knees, crying out that he had done no wrong. Steel flashed. The cries ended almost as quickly as they had begun. Blood spread slowly across the rush-covered floor. The hall became deathly still. Owen stood motionless. His hand had never left the hilt of his sword. He had not drawn it. He had not stopped them. He looked down at the bodies of his own uncles. The silence weighed upon him more heavily than the killing itself. Scene 5: The aftermath. Cadwallon surveyed the hall without expression. "Search the estate." The captain bowed. "My prince." No heir of Edwin leaves this place alive. The soldiers dispersed through the manor. Minutes later, the soldiers returned. "The estate has been searched." Cadwallon looked up. "Their heirs." The captain hesitated. "Lady Kristen and Cadogan." Two soldiers escorted them into the hall. Kristen walked first, her fair hair fallen loose from its braid, her face pale but composed. Beside her stood Cadogan. He looked scarcely older than a child. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, but he neither spoke nor lowered his eyes. He looked directly at Cadwallon. The hall remained silent. Owen glanced from the young woman to the boy. Neither carried a weapon. Neither could threaten Gwynedd. Cadwallon studied them only briefly. Neither can inherit Tejingle. He turned away. "Leave them." The soldiers obeyed. Owen remained where he was. Kristen slowly lifted her eyes to meet Owen's. Neither spoke. Neither looked away. Then Owen noticed Cadogan. The boy stood beside his sister without moving. Around him lay the bodies of his father and uncles. He did not cry. He did not plead. He simply stared at Cadwallon. Owen had seen anger before. He had seen grief. But never hatred born so completely in a single moment. Outside, the afternoon breeze stirred the leaves beyond the hall. Brother and sister watched the princes ride away. Neither spoke. Scene 6: Back at Aberffraw. The sun was sinking beyond the Menai Strait when the gates of Aberffraw finally opened. Two weary horses entered the courtyard. Neither rider spoke. The journey from Tejingle had been long, but it was not the miles that weighed upon them. Servants hurried forward to take the reins. One look at the princes' faces was enough. Something had happened. Word traveled quickly through the palace. By the time Owen and Cadwallon entered the great hall, Gruffydd had already risen from his chair. Age had transformed the young exile he had once been. Now over 60, Gruffydd's once dark hair and beard had faded almost entirely to gray. His shoulders stooped slightly, and the years showed in the lines carved deeply across his face. His sight was no longer what it had been, forcing him sometimes to narrow his eyes when looking across the hall. Yet age had diminished little of his presence. This was still Gruffydd ap Cynan, the man who had returned from exile again and again. The man who had survived Norman prisons, defeat and betrayal. The man who had spent most of his life reclaiming the kingdom his enemies had taken from him. The old king studied his sons in silence. Cadwallon still wore his mail, streaked with blood and the dust of the eastern roads. Owen's tunic also bore dark stains that no amount of washing would ever entirely remove. Neither man looked as they had that morning. Gruffydd needed no messenger, no herald. Whatever had happened in Tejingle had changed them both. He looked first towards Cadwallon. "Tell me." Cadwallon stepped forward. "The sons of Owen Fradwer are dead." Silence settled over the hall. Their households have been dispersed. Their lands now answer directly to the crown. Gruffydd's expression did not change. Only after several moments did he ask, "What happened?" "They were judged." They resisted. No, they confessed. Cadwallon held his father's gaze. They were not asked. For a long while Gruffydd said nothing. His eyes moved from Cadwallon to Owen. The younger prince had not spoken. His face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Gruffydd had seen that look before. Not upon warriors returning from defeat, but upon men who had witnessed something they wished they could forget. When he finally spoke, his voice carried neither anger nor triumph. Only weariness. I spent half my life reclaiming this kingdom. I have spent the other half persuading men to believe they belonged within it. Cadwallon said nothing. When I returned from exile, I could have destroyed the house of Edwin. I know. I did not. No. I chose peace. Cadwallon met his father's gaze. And peace left them powerful. It made them loyal. For now. No. Gruffydd shook his head. For a generation. He walked towards the great doors of the hall, looking out across the evening light falling upon the fields beyond Aberffraw. I knew what Owen Fradwar had done. I knew what his father had become. I knew the bitterness they carried. His hand rested upon the weathered timber of the doorway. But kingdoms are not held together by victory alone. They endure because yesterday's enemies choose to become tomorrow's countrymen. Cadwallon's expression hardened. And what happens when tomorrow's countrymen decide they are yesterday's enemies again? Gruffydd turned. Then you deal with the men who betray you. After they have opened Gwynedd to Chester. If that is what they do. Cadwallon shook his head. By then men are dead, lands are lost. Perhaps the prince himself is driven into exile. The words struck closer than either son could have intended. Gruffydd had lived exactly that life. Cadwallon stepped towards him. You taught us to learn from what happened to you. I did. Then I learned. Gruffydd studied his eldest son. I see that. Something in his answer silenced Cadwallon. Gruffydd looked towards the fading light again. Blood ends lives. His voice softened. It does not end memory. Cadwallon lowered his eyes. For the first time since entering the hall, some of the certainty left his face. I did what I thought Gwynedd required. Gruffydd looked at him. I know. That seemed to surprise Cadwallon. You think I was wrong. I think a prince should always fear the day he becomes certain that necessity excuses everything. Cadwallon absorbed that in silence. Gruffydd's gaze moved towards Owen. You disagree with your brother. Owen finally looked up. Yes. Would you have spared them? Owen hesitated. Cadwallon watched him. I don't know. It was not the answer either had expected. Owen looked towards his brother. Before today, I would have said yes. And now? I don't know. Cadwallon's expression softened slightly. Owen continued. I know what their father did. I know what their house once controlled. I know what could happen when you die, and every lord between the Conwy and Dee decides whether Gwynedd is still strong enough to command him. Gruffydd listened. But, Owen swallowed. I watched men die today because of what they might do tomorrow. Silence returned. I don't know if that was justice. Cadwallon answered quietly. It wasn't. Owen looked at him. Cadwallon's expression had not changed. It was protection. And you see no difference. I see every difference. For a moment, the brothers simply stared at one another. Gruffydd watched them both. Perhaps that troubled him most. Cadwallon understood what he had done. He simply believed it necessary. The old king crossed the hall and stopped before his eldest son. Gruffydd squeezed his shoulder. You see danger quickly, sometimes before I do. Cadwallon waited. That is a gift. Gruffydd's eyes remained upon him. Make certain it never becomes the only thing you see. Neither spoke. None was needed. Scene 7. The Hunt. By late afternoon, they began riding home. Cadwallader went ahead with the huntsman, still insisting that he had found the stag. You chased it into a marsh, Cadwallon called after him. I found the marsh too. Owen laughed. A successful day, then. Gruffydd smiled, but allowed his horse to fall slightly behind. He had watched them all day. That had been the purpose of bringing them here, though none of his sons knew it. 2 days earlier, Tejingle had unsettled something Gruffydd had believed settled for years. Not whether Gwynedd should remain whole. Of that he was certain. He had spent too much of his life gathering its pieces together to watch them scattered again amongst his sons. Rose, Rufoniog, Marianid, Diffrin Clwyd, Mon, Lyn, Arfan, Tejingle. One kingdom. It had to remain one kingdom. The problem was what came afterwards. The road climbed towards a ridge, and Cadwallader slowed until the others caught him. For a while they rode 4 abreast. Gruffydd looked across the lands below. When I am gone, he said, what becomes of Gwynedd? The laughter faded. Cadwallader glanced towards him. That is a cheerful thought. Answer it. Cadwallader looked towards his brothers. Cadwallon shrugged. We inherit. Gruffydd turned towards him. We. The single word immediately made all 3 sons wary. Cadwallon frowned. According to custom. According to custom, Gruffydd repeated. Owen was watching his father now. And what happens to Gwynedd? No one answered immediately. Cadwallader eventually said, we divide what is ours. Into 3. Unless you've acquired another son without telling us. Owen laughed. Gruffydd did not. Cadwallader's smile faded. Gruffydd gestured towards the country around them. Rose to one, Rufoniog to another, Marianid perhaps divided again, Mon separated from Arfan, Cantref after Cantref portioned out until every son can say his father treated him fairly. Cadwallon understood where the question was leading. And Gwynedd disappears. Not immediately. Gruffydd looked from one son to another. You might remain loyal to one another. Cadwallader grinned. I've tolerated them this long. Barely, Owen said. Gruffydd smiled faintly. And your sons? That silenced them. And theirs? The horses continued along the ridge. Gruffydd looked east. How many years have we spent bringing those lands beneath Aberffraw? Too many, Cadwallon answered. And how many generations would it take to divide them again? Owen looked across the kingdom. 1. Gruffydd nodded. 1. Cadwallader frowned. Then what are you saying? That Gwynedd must remain whole. His sons exchanged glances. It was Cadwallon who finally asked the obvious question. Then how? Gruffydd said nothing. Cadwallader looked between his father and brothers. You've just said dividing it destroys everything we've built. Yes. But there are 3 of us. I can count. Owen smiled faintly, but his eyes remained upon his father. And Welsh custom gives each of us a claim. Yes. Then one of those things has to give. Gruffydd looked at him. Owen waited. Gruffydd almost smiled. That was it. The question he had been asking himself for years. He had once believed he knew the answer. One kingdom. One heir. For years he had believed that heir would be Cadwallon. His eldest. Strong. Decisive. Already becoming the sort of warrior Gwynedd might need. It had seemed the simplest answer. One son to preserve what Gruffydd had spent a lifetime rebuilding. Until Tejingal. Gruffydd gathered his reins. Father, Cadwallader pressed. I said Gwynedd must remain whole. That wasn't the question. No. Then what's the answer? Gruffydd urged his horse forward. I haven't given you one. Cadwallader stared after him. He does that deliberately. Of course he does, Owain said. Cadwallon watched their father riding ahead. For once even he seemed uncertain. They followed. Gruffydd heard them begin arguing behind him. Not angrily. Trying to solve it. Cadwallader suggested dividing revenues without dividing authority. Cadwallon immediately explained why that would create 3 courts competing for the same loyalties. Owain asked who, in that arrangement, would command the armies. Gruffydd listened without joining them. Then he remembered Ireland. A boy standing before his father. A sword between them. The lesson Cynan had given him long before Gruffydd possessed anything worth inheriting. The sword did not belong to a man merely because he wanted it, nor because he was strongest, nor because blood alone entitled him to carry it. The man had to be worthy. Gruffydd looked towards Cadwallon. Strong, decisive, experienced. Cadwallon saw danger quickly and acted while other men were still deciding whether danger existed. Those qualities had helped push Gwynedd's frontier eastward. Today they had brought down the stag cleanly. 2 days earlier, they had killed 3 men who had not yet betrayed anyone. Gruffydd loved him no less for it. That was what made the question difficult. His gaze shifted towards Cadwallader. Fearless, quick, impulsive enough to chase a stag into a marsh simply because waiting irritated him. Gruffydd smiled despite himself. Then Owain. His middle son was listening while Cadwallon explained something, occasionally interrupting with a question. Gruffydd remembered him beneath the trees. The bow drawn. The stag exposed. A possible shot. Owain had let it go. Not from fear. Not because he lacked the skill. Because he had judged the risk greater than the reward. Then, when another opportunity came, Cadwallon had struck without hesitation. A king needed the courage to act. He also needed the judgment not to act. Gruffydd had learned both lessons painfully. Edwin had once fought beside him. His men had helped Gruffydd win Gwynedd at Bran or Urwa. Later Edwin had turned against him. Then Edwin's son, Owain Fradwar, had chosen the Normans and helped drive Gruffydd across the sea again. Cadwallon remembered those betrayals. So did Gruffydd. But Gruffydd remembered something else. He had married Angharad. He had welcomed the house of Edwin back into Gwynedd. For a generation, men descended from those who had once opposed him had answered Aberffraw faithfully. Sometimes danger had to be destroyed. Sometimes an enemy had to be given the chance to become something else. Knowing which was which. That was judgment. Perhaps that was where he himself had been wrong. He had been asking which custom would best preserve Gwynedd. Welsh division would destroy the kingdom. But giving everything to one son was not enough. The man mattered too. His father had understood that. The right man. Gruffydd looked at his sons again. 3 sons. 3 claims. 1 Gwynedd. None of them knew that for years he had believed Cadwallon would inherit it. None of them knew that Tejingal had changed that certainty. And none would know. Not yet. Gruffydd had spent too much of his life watching men change when a crown came within reach. He would not tell his sons they were being judged. He would simply judge them. Their courage, their patience, their wisdom, their mercy, how they treated the weak, how they answered danger, whether they knew when to fight, and whether they possessed the far rarer strength to choose peace. Ahead, Cadwallader said something that made Owain laugh. Cadwallon shook his head at them both. Gruffydd's gaze lingered upon Owain for a moment longer than the others. Then he looked away. He had chosen no heir. There was no need to choose today. For the first time, he understood what the choice would eventually require. Gwynedd would pass undivided to one son. Not necessarily the firstborn. Not necessarily the strongest. To the one who proved himself most worthy to preserve the kingdom Gruffydd had spent a lifetime rebuilding. His father had taught him the lesson long ago, with a sword between them. A thing of value could survive generations, but only if it passed into the right hands. The right man,